Hello and greetings from Cupertino in California. I'm Mayor Darcy Paul, and I'd like to start by thanking Mayor Hoyoyi of New Taipei City for inviting me to your Earth Day Forum today. I'm very grateful to be able to share with you all the things that Cupertino is doing in order to help keep our climate healthy, and hopefully we can work in conjunction with each other and the rest of the world to make sure that we have a safe and bright future for everyone involved. And so today what I'd like to do is to give you a few images and visuals and share with you some of the things that Cupertino has been doing more recently. But I think that the best backdrop to start this off with is a mention of the fact that we started with a climate action plan a number of years ago in Cupertino. And that climate action plan was something that was really quite innovative with regard to our local municipalities coming up with various types of measures that we'd like to take in order to proceed with helping to keep the environment clean and safe for everyone. And so as a result of that, we did get recognized more recently. There was a World Forum in Glasgow on climate change, and so Cupertino was recognized as one of the local governments that were making a difference. However, what we decided to do a little bit more recently is to have an update to our climate action plan, which is where we find ourselves in the middle of right now in Cupertino. So I'm going to go ahead and start a presentation here. And so let me go ahead and show you this. This is our one of our multi-language flyers that we use in Cupertino. Very simple. We support climate action because frankly, there is no planet B. And we do have a multicultural, multilingual community here in Cupertino. A very significant demographic is Chinese language speaking. And so we did have this ready for distribution, and we have distributed to our community. To give you an idea of what we're looking at in Cupertino, we have a survey that we're conducting right now, and we are evaluating the results of it. We ended up having it last fall in 2021. And so if you look at the breakdown demographically of the survey respondents, there were roughly 110, 108 exactly. And so you look at the demographics of Cupertino, and this is actually not an unfair representation. We're certainly very multi-ethnic with the greatest percentage of Asian and Asian Americans in Cupertino, and the second greatest white or Caucasian. And roughly between those two, very large swaths of demographic groups, we have the substantial majority of the city. But as you can see, it's almost 2/3 or so Asian American. And in fact, it is something that we are aware of in our day-to-day basis, but we also take a lot of pride in evaluating people based upon the merits of their ideas and their thinking. And so that's the demographic group that we deal with in Cupertino from the perspective of how does this really break down on a larger basis. The next way that we look at it here is by a couple of different factors. You have the age groups, and you have where people spend most of their time. And so this is also, fairly reflective, not necessarily of our demographic. We do tend to have an older demographic. And so if you were looking at the breakdown of Cupertino itself, as opposed to the respondents to the survey, you'd probably see a little bit of a greater percentage of people 65 years or older, which at this survey is about 19%. I think that is probably a bit higher in Cupertino, and it will be increasing as it is, frankly, throughout the world. But in terms of the concern for the climate change equation, you do see the largest section of this pie in the 19 to 44 age range of 45%. And so, I think that bodes well. We do have a young and very engaged demographic here, obviously, as you would imagine, in the heart of Silicon Valley, working and very concerned about some of our major future problems, especially as pertains to environmental measures. Now, I thought it would be useful to kind of share, to give you an idea of our city, where do people tend to spend their time the most? As you can see, we have a number of different places, but the people that are, very interested in climate issues, they tend to be around our park spaces. Memorial Park is actually our largest park. It says Northwest, but really it's kind of in the middle of Cupertino. You have a lot of people from Cupertino High School, which is understandable. We have 3 high schools in Cupertino itself. And the one that's in the, I would say, densest area of town is Cupertino High School. You have some De Anza College students. That's a community college, basically a 2-year community college before people, if they choose to do so, transfer out to a 4-year college. You have people that are in a very environmental area of our city. This is designated as Southwest McClellan Ranch. It's basically kind of a nature preserve area of Cupertino. And then finally, as you would imagine, people know Cupertino as the home of Apple. Some 10% or so of the survey respondents come from either the Apple campus that was originally on Infinite Loop and is still there, or Apple Park, which is their new corporate campus that they opened in Cupertino in this last 7 or 8 years. So that's kind of your mix geographically of where people are responding in our city. And it's also a fair representation of where you might find a good representation of people who are extremely concerned about environmental measures in our city. So what are we really looking at here? In Cupertino, we're trying to be sure that we're approaching this in a systematic manner, as you would imagine. But really, what we're focusing on right now is our carbon neutrality. And so if you really want to break it down in relative terms, you see the carbon output, represented on the far left-hand side of this graph. You've got waste, wastewater, electricity, which is actually fairly low. I'll go into that in a moment. Natural gas, off-road equipment, and transportation, the latter of which takes up about more than half of this 360,000 metric tons or so of carbon output that we have every year. So our city council, we've directed a target of things that we can control from the municipal level as a government to make sure that the municipality itself, for all of our facilities, are carbon neutral by the year 2030. And so our projection is, roughly half, maybe a little bit less, of that carbon footprint being eliminated in Cupertino by the year 2030. Now, our much more, I guess, ambitious target is another 10 years out from there, trying to make sure that we as a city, as a jurisdiction, as a whole, end up achieving that carbon neutrality in 2040. So what does that look like? Well, of course, you have things like, personal water heaters in people's homes, which are, largely gas right now. They can be converted to electric. You have the cooking, of course, going kind of clockwise from the upper left in this picture, or the series of pictures rather. On the upper right-hand side, you have a picture of a van. That's actually a shuttle service that Cupertino has implemented to try to encourage ride sharing. And so ultimately, transportation, as you saw, was a very large component of Cupertino's efforts towards carbon neutrality. And so we want to make sure that we have that as a mechanism, and hopefully, sooner rather than later, electrify the fleet. Waste, of course, everyone knows what trash receptacles look like. On the lower right-hand corner, you've got trash, you've got the recyclables, and you've got the compostables in the middle. And so what we really want to do is to examine that part of the equation and be able to make sure that we're not just carbon neutral, but also, waste-free city in the net totality of it. And then in the middle of the bottom, you have a sign for a bike route. And so, of course, you can't get too much more carbon neutral than using your own, internalized power to get yourself around. And so we are taking many efforts to try to make our city more bike and pedestrian friendly. And then finally, you have a building on the lower left-hand corner, as well as an EV charger. And so we're going to be looking at, hopefully, a world where there's more of these facilities available on a widespread basis. And then you also have to think about making sure that your buildings are as carbon neutral as possible, because that's a big part of the components. with regard to surveying and trying to get the concerns of the various people that responded here, in no particular order, you do have a number of very pragmatic, types of concerns that are represented when people are asked, very specific things with regard to what their concerns are environmentally. So interestingly enough, in this part of the survey, the respondents that are most extremely concerned, so the ones where you have the most extreme concern are first drought and water supply. You had 75 people responding to the survey right here that stated that they're extremely concerned about the drought and water supply. And then second, you have wildfires and smoke, which is, I actually find that very fascinating because ultimately, these are impacts of climate change, of course. But it also shows that we have an extremely pragmatic, an extremely practical city. Because of course, what are we hit with in Northern California and in California in general? We're hit with lack of water, and we're hit with more recently in the last several years, wildfires. And so, people are most concerned with what they experience all the time. And we are experiencing all the time a lack of water. And we live in just constant, concern for the summer months because, of course, the wildfires are ramping up due to, a lot of dryness in the environment. So the next piece of information I'd like to share with you is to give you a sense, kind of more in a generalized, perspective. If we're talking to our Cupertino residents and culling the survey information, what is it that they would like to think in terms of more general principles? Well, they value a high quality of living for future generations. They would like to improve the air quality. And third, preserving natural spaces and habitats. So it's also very pragmatic in terms of the quality of living, standard. That is indeed a fair reflection of the priorities here. But very close behind that is, the fact that people breathe in air all the time. This is something that we have a constant concern about, and it's not just a matter of carbon neutrality. It's also a matter of other emissions that our residents have been constantly concerned about over the years. And then we also have a very strong affinity towards the ecology, the plant life, the animal life, and so that's pretty well reflected within this survey here. Now, when you're really talking about our approach to how to go ahead and take a problem as multifaceted and as important as environmental stewardship, one of the most important things to think about to get this from the level of abstract to the specific is to think about what the barriers are. And so when we started surveying our public to try to figure out what their perceptions of the barriers were, part of the reason is that as a community that really likes to take on very challenging problems and hopefully turn them into opportunities to make things better or more interesting or more capable for everyone around the world, the first thing we really do is to look at, okay, what are the barriers? And so I'll read off the top four here. There's this concern of cost and competing economic demands on the city and residents, which is absolutely fair. When you're trying to do something extremely different, you're immediately going to see a lot of those economic impacts get really, really prevalent. And one of the examples that you can see, in fact, is things like petroleum, for instance. If you're trying to deal with the energy equation in such a profound way, of course, things like gasoline prices are going to have some significant impacts, for instance. And so that's something that's very realistically and pragmatically on people's minds here. Second, lack of agreement on the issues or how to prioritize them. That is also, very, very practical. It's the idea that, hey, in the environment is something that literally affects everything. And so with regard to how we deal with these issues and who gets in line first or what gets in line, first, and where do we prioritize a little bit lower, those are fair questions. Resistance to new mandates and requirements, especially in the United States and in the stated principles of our society as being open and free and aspirational. If you want to make sure that people have that freedom of opinion and thought, you also have to think about resistance. You also have to think about the pushback. And so that's also a very smart and practical problem to prioritize highly. Fourth, level of education and understanding about climate change in the community. People, I think this kind of takes a turn for the really pragmatic, right? You just want to make sure that you're having a conversation on even footing throughout the communities that you're dealing with. So we're always aware of that. And so if you're interested in the other, aspects of the challenges, they're there. And but I wanted to talk about this top four when we're thinking about how to go about modifying our already a very ambitious climate action plan to have a new climate action plan too in our city. So I'll just give you one example. So with regard to off-road equipment, such as construction machinery and landscaping tools in particular, what we're trying to do in Cupertino is to ensure that within 8 years, by 2030, that we're roughly 25% electric, and then we're giving ourselves another 10 years after that to become fully electric by the year 2040. And one of the reasons that this is really important to me is that, I look at various things, and we'll take the second example here, landscaping tools. I look at things like leaf blowers. I'm not sure if leaf blowers are a ubiquitous thing all around the world, but for us, you have these two-stroke engines, with petroleum, and they basically are reverse vacuums, right? They move leaves around, and they're part of the landscaping. And so I would like to have made sure that our leaf blowers are electric, right? And so we tried to pass some legislation or introduce some legislation about a year and a half ago, and it really didn't get legs. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that people aren't quite ready, and also the battery packs aren't quite strong enough in order to really make up for the fact that you actually have more horsepower in the leaf blowing equipment. And so the thing is, if you give yourself some reasonable runways here it's 25% electric by 2030, which is fine. I would like to have seen that a little bit earlier, but at the same time, have to be reasonable in terms of how you look at these targets. And then, of course, you have another 10 years from 2030 to 2040 to make sure that everything transitions to fully electric. So that's an example of one area, for instance. But I also did want to give you a good sense of how we're looking to prioritize a lot of these things, particularly in our city. And this is a list of about 11 things. And as things go, we are also very pragmatic. You'll notice I like to use the word pragmatic or practical in this context. In terms of prioritizing everything. So you get everything from number one, if you do this is going to have the biggest impact, which is achieving 35% of public and shared transit mode share by 2030 and 40% by 2040. You notice that we're not basically trying to say, well, everyone has to share, a vehicle by 2040. We're not, I don't want to say we're not that ambitious, but I think we're not that unrealistic. There is a very strong tendency for people to have vehicle independence and movement independence in this area. So when we look at it, we think it's really more about electrifying the various vehicles that are out there. And so that actually can have a very substantial impact, and in fact, the most impactful of all the things that we can be doing. Second is the residential buildings and electrification. You go from gas and you increase the efficiency of the buildings themselves, and then you have basically what amounts to the second most impactful measure you can take in order to reduce the carbon footprint. Now, we have a whole list of 11 items, and I won't read you through every single one of them, but the 11th one becomes achieving our target of a 15% of bicycle mode share by 2030, and then increasing that by relatively modest 10% by 2040. And even though that's not necessarily one of the top 10, it's the 11th most impactful thing that we can be doing for our carbon footprint. It does do a couple of other things, right? For every bike you put on the road, if people are actually using it to get to the store or to commute, that's one less car. And so for people driving the cars, and they kind of question, why should we be supportive of these types of measures? You're affecting our road infrastructure and whatnot. Well, the fact of the matter is, for one more person biking to work, that's one less person that you have to compete with for a parking spot. So, that's just something that, one way of thinking about the problem in terms of the acceptance among the people that might have a little bit more, let's say, inertia in terms of wondering why this all makes sense. And I think that inertia is rapidly getting lower and lower as people are living with the real life effects of climate change, of course. So leave you with that list of things that Cupertino is looking to do specifically. And then finally, I did want to show an example of what the general area does look like. We love our trails and our hills. And so if you go up the mountain a little bit in the West Valley, you do have a lot of good open space, but this is kind of what it looks like. It's not a totally clear day, as a lot of our days are. But at the same time, we look forward to a very optimistic future. Hopefully we can clean up the air and the carbon emissions. One of the things that we consider, of course, is to have more of a tree canopy. And trees are great, of course, because they're kind of, reverse, machines that actually take the carbon out of the air and give us oxygen. So I'm going to leave you with that. This is another flyer that we put out in Cupertino. And of course, it's because we don't actually have other planets. There's only one planet that we have right now. So thank you very much for all of the efforts from New Taipei City. Thank you very much, Mayor Ho, all of my friends in New Taipei City. It's wonderful to be able to participate with you in today's program. And I hope that you have a wonderful health and safe rest of your 2022. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.